By the time of his 50th birthday in 1929, Stalin had gained control of the Soviet Union. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, he had put his own men into office, squeezing out the opposition. Stalin now set about transforming the country into a modern world power, no matter what price in human life. We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries, Stalin said. We must make good this distance in 10 years or go under. The massive industrialization program Stalin now launched required huge sacrifices. Most of the sacrifices would fall on the peasants. Stalin began by forcing them all into collective farms. His aim was to ensure the supply of food to the state by turning the countryside into one huge agricultural factory. Collectivization had a strong ideological motive. Forcing the peasants to work directly for the state would turn them, the party believed, into socialists. There was one category beyond socialist redemption, the kulaks, or rich exploiting peasants. They were blamed in Soviet propaganda newsreels for everything from arson to murder. In fact, there had been no real kulak since the 1917 revolution. The state simply branded anyone as a kulak who was better off or who resisted collectivization. On the 27th of December 1929, Stalin announced that the kulaks would be eliminated as a class. 10 million men, women and children were to be driven off the land. Some were simply shot. The party mobilized the young activists for the assault, forcing socialism into the countryside, whatever the cost. For those churning out the broadsheets, the socialist end justified the drastic means.
Так же, как расправу с крестьянами. Мы думали, что вот крестьянам будет лучше теперь. Вот кулаков выселили, в колхозы людей загнали, и вот теперь они постепенно станут социалистами. Я сейчас понимаю, что это было преступление у карьеристов, у холодных людей. Это было преступление двойное. У нас, у глупых или самообманывающихся, или обманутых мальчишек, или полуграмотных идеалистов, это было преступление невольное, но тем не менее очень большое.
Abdurrahman Avtakhanov witnessed the effects of this crime during a stop on a train journey in the early 30s.
Бесконечное поле с людьми, женщинами, детьми, стариками и все общий вой. Их погружают в скотские вагоны и отправляют себе. Я одному человеку задал вопрос, станционному смотрителю, там, какому-то начальнику. Что это такое? Что случилось здесь? А ты что, с Луны свалился или из Персии прибыл сюда? Коллективизация и ликвидация кулачества как класс.
But by eliminating the kulaks, the state was getting rid of its most successful farmers. The food supply crisis became acute. Forced into collective farms, many peasants first slaughtered their animals. Stalin sent requisition squads out into the country. They were made up of party activists and members of the GPU, the Internal State Security Agency.
They do find some grain, but this grain is the material to sow. It's a sowing grain, so they take away this too. This means famine.
The most fertile parts of the Soviet Union were the hardest hit. The famine began in 1932, spreading across the Ukraine, the Kuban, and the areas of the Don and Volga rivers. A vast stretch of land with 40 million inhabitants. The requisition squads descended without mercy on villages and collective farms. It didn't matter that a family had given up all the food it had for its own survival.
І ця комісія ходила у кожну хату, з хати в хату, і все забирала до зернинки, до квасолинки. І так же поступила і з нашою сім'єю. І все зачистили до останньої зернини, і ми залишили нашу сім'ю на явну голодну смерть.
Alisa Maslow and her 5-year-old brother were sent to an orphanage like this one. He died there of hunger. Meanwhile, her mother and older brother lay sick from famine at home. Every village had its cart to haul away the dead. Alisa arrived home one day to find her older brother dead as well, and the cart outside.
Заходить у хату, стягнув цього старшого брата з печі, витягнув на віз, положив, а тоді заразом і живу маму. Я стала плакати, він говорить, а ти йди у Майдан, там тобі дадуть похльобухи, а вона все одно помре, я за нею другий раз їхати не буду. І так я пішла, плачучи на цей колгосп, цей Майдан, і залишилася круглою сиротою, без нікого.
News of the famine and the mounting death toll reached Stalin from a number of different sources, including the GPU. But Stalin paid no heed. There was no hope of aid from abroad. Malcolm Muggeridge, almost alone among Western journalists, visited the Ukraine, reported what he saw, and left immediately. Other reporters were too worried about being thrown out of the country to cover the famine. Many Westerners, like George Bernard Shaw, visited in the early 30s and saw no hunger. Shaw was mightily impressed. The Soviet Union was, he felt, a great social experiment. By 1933, millions were dead. There is now no doubt that the famine was man-made by Stalin. The price of Stalin's vengeance was between 5 and 7 million dead from the famine. In this one small Ukrainian village, over 360 men, women and children died. Still remembered, still mourned. The peasants could not easily turn to their church. Orthodox faith, central to peasant life for 1,000 years, was trampled underfoot when there was most need of its guidance and comfort. Stalin had trained as a priest in his youth. He now presided over the virtual destruction of religion. The Soviet state was officially atheist. Lenin had declared that every idea of God is unutterable vileness. Priests were rounded up. Churches turned into grain stores or rubble. The Soviet state had no use for old theology. It had its own. Industrialization was the new faith. Factories were its cathedrals. Its priests were the elite workers who smashed production targets and led the way to the future. Not all who built cities like Magnitogorsk were superheroes. Many were peasants exiled as kulaks. Unskilled and untrained, they faced severe problems in adapting to industrial processes. These problems were interpreted by the state as sabotage.
Я ни разу не видел, чтобы кто-нибудь из рабочих, из инженеров занимался вредительством. Я видел людей, не умеющих работать, и в силу этого допускающих ошибки, промахи, поломку машины.
Stalin used show trials designed to publicize the threat of wreckers. Engineers and managers were rounded up and accused of fictitious conspiracies. Instead of relaxing tempos, Stalin increased them. Production lines were halted not by traitors, but by a lack of the right parts, often matched by too many of the wrong kind. The first tractor proudly wheeled out of the Stalingrad tractor factory was a dummy. So delayed and mismanaged was the production schedule. Managers who pleaded for more realistic planning were accused of wrecking. Initiative was paralyzed. Skilled people were shot or sent to the camps. There had been prison camps in Lenin's time, but under Stalin, the camp network, known as the Gulag, grew. By 1931, the Gulag held nearly 2 million men and women. Forced labor by innocent people was now a key part of the economy. The demand for labor led to arrest quotas. Many people found themselves in the Gulag simply because Stalin needed their labor to build whatever he wanted, wherever he wanted it. He had a fascination for grandiose projects, like this one, the Belomor Canal. Stalin took the map of the Soviet Union, drawing onto it himself the route of this strategic waterway. 270 kilometers long, it was designed to give Stalin's navy access between the Baltic and White Seas. Construction involved joining up the lakes of Soviet Karelia with a series of canals. Variations in water levels were handled by 19 locks. Building the Belomor Canal involved 250,000 prisoners. Peasants, priests, criminals, academics, men and women. Innocents counted for nothing. To keep costs down, the GPU spent no hard currency abroad on heavy equipment. It was all built by hand. Pile drivers were powered not by steam, but by people, forced into giant human treadmills.
Никаких даже рукавиц не давали. Это голыми руками. Тащили тросы. Это металлические тросы. И причем многие тросы, вернее, все они почти были старые, колючие. Они же проволочные, из тонкой проволоки. Все были изранены, кровь течет. Эти люди падали, травм много, не приспособлены ничего. И все это люди не умели. Вот. Ну и, конечно, это была невероятно тяжелая работа, каторжная.
The guards shot anyone who tried to escape. Food was rationed according to work output, ensuring the death of the weak and ill. The terrible cold and sheer exhaustion killed the most. Burial was rudimentary. Bodies were simply tossed into ditches.
Уже к весне, когда уже таять стало, то руки, ноги и головы, прямо это же близко все-таки 100-150 метров, прямо все это просматривается, это торчат из-под снега, из зимы, из земли, и уже воронье там летает над ними, еще они, можно сказать, были заморожены, свежие, и их там клюют.
Opening day, August 1933. The prisoners anxiously awaited their release as promised. But tens of thousands were not freed, kept on to maintain the canal or else transferred to other forced labor projects. Stalin came to open the canal himself. He is said to have been disappointed with his brainchild. It turned out to be too shallow and too narrow. It froze solid half the year and was bombed by the Germans early in the war. Over 60,000 men and women lost their lives building it. Stalin's policies and despotic methods were now being called into question. Some dared discuss his removal from office. There were criticisms of Stalin's policies close to home. From his second wife, Nadezhda Alliluyeva. She was 22 years younger than Stalin and studying textile production. They did not get on well, and Nadezhda was highly strung. One night in November 1932, after a public row with Stalin, she shot herself dead. Stalin's response was one of bitter resentment. He went up to her coffin at the funeral and made as if to push it away, saying, "She left me as an enemy." One man in the Politburo seemed a possible rival to Stalin, his close friend Sergei Kirov, the popular Leningrad party boss. In 1934, delegates gathered for the 17th Communist Party Congress in Moscow. There would be a crucial vote for re-election to the party's Central Committee. Some delegates saw this as a chance to replace Stalin with Kirov. A group of Leningrad party members had met privately to plan this strategy at the flat of Nikolai and Natalia Rodionov.
Перебирали, какие делегации, сколько голосов, сколько всего будет делегатов, и какой процент голосов будет, безусловно, за Сергея Мироновича. Ну, там вспоминали Ивано-Вознесенскую область, Закавказье, ну, Ленинградская, само собой, потом Казахстан и Астрахань. Но остальные я не помню еще. Они подсчитывали, сколько в каждой делегации примерно лиц, и сколько будет говорить за Кирова. Против Сталина я ничего не слышала, ничего не говорилось. Просто, значит, они хотели, чтобы был Киров первым секретарем.
Kirov was also secretly approached by senior party figures and asked if he would accept the post of General Secretary.
Было тайное совещание, на котором Кирову предлагали встать на место Сталина генсеком. Конечно, после этого Сталин, когда узнал, он решил его устранить. И Киров это сознавал. Когда он вернулся в 17-ю съезд, он своим друзьям и родным говорил, что моя голова теперь на плахе.
Kirov refused the offer. It was at the voting in the Congress for membership of the Central Committee that Stalin got the true picture of his popularity in the party. When the ballot boxes were opened, only 3 votes were cast against Kirov, but 292 people voted against Stalin. Stalin's loyal henchman, Lazar Kaganovich, was taken aside and told about the problem. Kaganovich made the necessary arrangement to ensure Stalin received the same number of votes as Kirov.
Мы вскрыли с разрешения Политбюро пакеты с бюллетенями и установили, что не хватает 289 бюллетеней. А ведь, когда докладывали на съезде, сказали, что 3. Значит, 3 и 289, значит, он получил 292 против. А сейчас фальсифицируют, что неизвестно, он, может быть, только 3 получил. Потому что уничтожили документы, бюллетени сожгли.
Communist Party headquarters, Leningrad, 10 months later. On the 1st of December 1934, Kirov was working in his office. A 30-year-old misfit named Nikolaev entered the building and went up to the 2nd floor. Kirov's office was near the end of the corridor.
Они вышли здесь в кабинет, как раз муж стоял и разговаривал с этой Катей. И в это время раздался выстрел. Они выскочили в коридор и увидели, что Сергей Миронович падает. Как раз против дверей. Ну, это, может быть, метров в 5 от дверей моего мужа.
Kirov's colleagues were quick to grab hold of Nikolaev.
И вот Николаев в это время это рассказывали уже мужу, что он кричал, что а ведь мне же обещали.
Kirov was accorded a full state funeral. The outpourings of grief were a genuine mark of his popularity. Stalin's response to the news of Kirov's murder was a decree ordering the immediate death penalty for acts of terror with no possible reprieve. It was clear that Nikolaev had not acted alone. But whose orders was he following? Olga Shatanovskaya was appointed to Khrushchev's commission of inquiry into Kirov's death. Khrushchev declared the conclusion too explosive to publish. She reveals it here for the first time.
А наше расследование показало, что убийство Кирова организовано Сталином. Потому что это было не первое покушение, это было третье покушение уже.
The operation was run from the Leningrad headquarters of the secret police, by 1934 renamed the NKVD. In overall command was Genrikh Yagoda, Stalin's head of the NKVD. Nikolaev bore a grudge against Kirov, which they exploited. He was given extensive training, including target practice.
Он же на допросе у Сталина это сказал все, что меня 4 месяца работники НКВД готовили, уверяли, что так нужно для партии и государства.
The commission discovered that Kirov's bodyguard had been detained by NKVD men outside party headquarters to give Nikolaev a clear field upstairs. The commission spoke to hundreds of witnesses, unraveling the vote rigging at the 17th Party Congress and the secret offer of the General Secretaryship to Kirov, who then knew his days were numbered. Olga Shatanovskaya is adamant.
Неопровержимо доказано, что убийство Кирова организовано Сталином.
Stalin quickly covered his tracks. Nikolaev was shot. Kirov's bodyguard was clubbed to death. Mass arrests followed, generally at night. In time, most of the nearly 2,000 delegates to the 17th Party Congress were wiped out, and their memories with them. By 1935, 100,000 people had been arrested in Leningrad alone. Innocent people sent to the camps or shot. In this frame of mind, Stalin turned upon old defeated rivals, starting with Zinoviev and Kamyanev, party veterans from the earliest days of Lenin. Show trials became Stalin's device for proving that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies and infiltrated by spies. This then justified further repressions. Zinoviev and Kamyanev appeared in a show trial like this one, accused of murdering Kirov and conspiring with Stalin's arch-enemy, Leon Trotsky, exiled abroad. They were shot in 1936. The export of communism abroad had been Trotsky's idea. In the early 30s, the Comintern, the international party organization, had tried to foster revolution in countries like Germany. But Stalin was suspicious of foreigners and of all contact with them. Rather than supporting the Comintern, he undermined it. Loyal Comintern agents were now rounded up.
Даже был момент, когда я думала, и я долго придерживалась этого мнения, что они меня арестовали перед тем, как послать меня на такую серьезную подпольную работу как коммунистку, чтобы проверить, как я себя буду вести, если я окажусь в очень сложных условиях.
The Soviet Union turned in on itself, looking no further than its great leader for inspiration. Soviet propaganda made Stalin into a living god, infallible and all-knowing, revered and loved.
Нельзя было простому смертному выдержать такого натиска со стороны самого Сталина, со стороны сталинского режима, со стороны сталинского аппарата, давление на психику, на разум, на сердце, на душу человека. День и ночь радио нас убеждало, что Сталин величайший человек, благодетель человечества, отец народу, гений всех времен и народов.
The country proclaimed itself unanimous behind Stalin. Stalin's taste prevailed in every aspect of Soviet life, particularly the arts. Painters, poets, novelists, composers were forced to conform. Those who could not fell silent or were sent to the camps. And yet, there were positive achievements in the 30s. Giant projects like the Moscow Metro exemplified Soviet technology. The urban population doubled, becoming literate, better educated, and upwardly mobile. For many, the sacrifices were justified in the name of progress, their countries and their own. The truth was, the system wasn't working. By 1936, grain production was at pre-First World War levels and falling. Industrial targets were being revised upwards, but investment cut. The response was to send in more party officials to farm and factory. But this only made matters worse. As it grew, the bureaucracy was stifling the centralized system which spawned it. Red tape, endless paperwork, doing things by the book, all ensured no one took any initiative. People were loyal to the boss and to their own position and privileges. Getting things done came last.
Вот это еще к тому же имело внутреннюю закономерность разложения. Чем больше строят, тем труднее управлять сверху, потому что контроль снизу по существу отсутствует. Ответственности верха перед низом нет. Ответственность есть только снизу вверх, перед начальством. Понимаете? И чем пирамидальнее, чем больше, шире эта пирамида, тем хуже она работает.
Stalin had an explanation for these failures in the system he himself had created. He was convinced that enemies of the working class were to blame. The Soviet state had tried to get rid of all other social classes, but some elements clung on. The fight against them, he said, had to be intensified, because they would fight to the death, but not in open fight. They would strike anywhere at any time. The country had to be on its guard day and night. Anyone might be an enemy of the people. Stalin turned to the secret police, the NKVD. Run from the Lubyanka in Moscow, totally loyal, utterly ruthless. An empire in itself, not just prison camp guards and torturers, but people who mended the vehicles, who typed the orders for barbed wire, all part of the system. Yagoda, organizer of Kirov's murder, was out of office and doomed. But Stalin could rely on the new boss, Nikolai Yezhov, to do his bidding. Of course there will be victims in this fight, Yezhov told his men. When you cut down the forest, wood chips fly. The ground was prepared. The highly restrictive Tsarist system of internal passports had been reintroduced. The state could now monitor and control all movements inside the country. New repressive laws had been passed, making almost anything imaginable an offense against the Soviet state. Punishment, including execution, was now extended down to 12-year-olds. But if enemies of the people could be anywhere, how to find them? Informing, even by children, provided the answer. Olga Balikina, a young pioneer, denounced her father to the authorities for stealing on the collective farm. She became a heroine overnight, showered with approval and gifts. In the adult world, informers received part of the assets of their victims. It was a way of making money and settling old scores, taking over someone's apartment, their job, even their husband or wife.
Моя мать рассказывала мне, что единственным показанием, по которому ее арестовали и дали срок 8 лет, по обвинению в контрреволюционной деятельности, были показания Астрова. Она пришла со слезами, она не знала прежде об этом, она пришла со слезами и говорила, что какой ужас, как он мог, он же знал, что этого не было.
The man who denounced Eichenwald's mother was Valentin Astrov.
Ну, анализируйте все эти причины, но факт остается фактом. Народу-то я не изменял ведь тому, когда это делал, потому что весь народ так думал. А по существу, конечно, изменял, получается. Сейчас я вижу, и это мучительно очень.
Astrov agreed to turn informer after a spell in prison and the removal of his party card.
Позором сотрудничать с советскими социалистическими органами безопасности я не считал никогда и не считаю. И раньше не считал, когда не давал этого обязательства, не Во время, когда я его давал, и когда сейчас, это для меня была единственная ниточка, которая меня связывала с моей партией.
The NKVD vans were known as the Black Ravens. They generally went out at night.
Часа в 2 ночи, 21 ноября, раздался стук ко мне в комнату. Мы жили в общей квартире. Дома был мой муж и моя сестра, которая тогда со мной жила. Дверь открыла без ключ от нашей квартиры. Был у нашей дворничихи, которая занималась уборкой квартиры. И она без звонка открыла дверь и подвела прямо к нашей комнате, что было довольно жестоко с ее стороны. Пришли 2 человека и делали тщательно, но мы спали. Они меня арестовали и привезли меня на Лубянку.
Stalin legalized torture as both justifiable and appropriate. The NKVD used beatings, water torture, electric shock. The most effective, though, was the simplest.
Ну а самое обычное – это не давать спать во время этого конвейера совершенно круглыми сутками. Я сам это прошел на Лубянке, просто не давали спать. Ты только утром собираешься встать, только собираешься вечером поздно лечь спать, как тебя вызывают на допрос. И когда ты утром после ночного допроса приходишь, хочешь отдохнуть, подъем, тебя поднимают. И вот так сутки, вторые, третьи, по 10, по 15 дней человек не выдерживает. Тебя могли не бить, а просто бессонницей мучить.
Vans from the Lubyanka brought the bodies of the dead down this road, 5 miles from the center of Moscow. They stopped here. In the late 30s, it was open ground.
И однажды мы, значит, бежали сюда играть. Вот с этого бугорка. Вот, видим, машина стоит. И разгружают, в общем, людей. Совершенно голых. Люди стояли, значит, человека 3 их было. Были на них одеты перчатки резиновые, халаты темные и фартуки резиновые. Вот они, значит, их и выкидывали. У них в руках были крючки, они и крючками их выкидывали.
For those who survived interrogation, the next destination, and for millions the final destination, was the Gulag. The camps filled up with party members, the military, artists, scientists, bureaucrats, even the NKVD itself.
Понятно, что выжить, я уже говорил, что этапы приходят целыми поездами, и через 2-3 недели они плашмя лежат, опухают и мочатся под себя, и уже встать не могут, и погибают целиком.
Survival exacted a terrible toll, as Olga Schlossberg realized when she finally got to a bathhouse with a mirror.
Я кричу: зеркало, зеркало, а мы побежали все, мы 4 года себя не видели. Ну и все без платья, все голые, бежим к этому зеркалу. Подбежали, целая толпа. Я не вижу, где я не могу себя найти. Я же была молодая, я помнила себя молодой. И вдруг я увидела глаза моей мамы и седую голову с проседью сильной. И я поняла, что это я.
The camps spread across the land in clusters, The gold mining camps in the Far East, with a special camp for torture and execution. Igarka in Siberia, with its lumber and port construction. Railway building in Pechora, coal mining in Vorkuta. Bitterly cruel regimes in the harshest climates. The punishment of millions of innocent people. Many thought that Stalin knew nothing of the terror. If only he could be told, they said, he'd soon put a stop to it.
Можете рассчитывать на то, что товарищ Сталин сумеет выполнить свой долг перед народом. Перед рабочим классом. Перед крестьянством. Перед интеллигенцией.
But Stalin knew all about the terror.
Я собственными глазами видел десятки, сотни документов, на которых стоит роспись Сталина, утверждение огромного количества списков к смертной казни. Наиболее потрясающие я такой группу документов нашел, когда 12 декабря 1938 года Сталин и Молотов подписали около 30 списков, но общей численностью 3182 человека. 3182 человека к смертной казни в течение одного дня. И после этого, как я подсчитал, мне многие дни известны по часам даже, чем Сталин занимался, он пошел с Молотовым смотреть свой очередной ночной фильм.
Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, once interceded to save the life of a school friend's father. She was told never to do it again. By the late 30s, Stalin was increasingly capricious. He could be open, charming even, but his moods were ever more dark and suspicious. Alexander Avdyenko, now a writer, was hauled before his hero for a film script Stalin didn't like.
Сталин, а я его видел в метре от себя. Он все время ходил вокруг, мимо меня. Он все время обращался ко мне, тыкал в меня трубкой и пальцем, не сводил с меня глаз. Гневный, желтый глаз, нечеловеческий глаз хищника. И очень громко разговаривал, кричал. У него была пена на губах. Он гневался, как бог Саваоф. Он был абсолютно не похож на того Сталина, которого я привык видеть.
There were still old enemies. The remnants of the leadership under Lenin were subjected to the biggest show trial of all, as Stalin tried to obliterate the parts of Soviet history he didn't like, in which he hadn't been the hero. The main accused were Lenin's old colleagues, ex-Prime Minister Alexei Rykov and Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin had been the party theoretician, educated and popular. He and Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union together in the 1920s. Stalin had pushed him out of office and now wanted him dead. First, Bukharin had to be denounced by Valentin Astrov.
Была очная ставка с Бухариным, где я пытался, так сказать, доказать ему, что надо признать такой смысл. Подтекст этого был, что надо признать это, вот, что мы обязаны это сделать, раз партия этого хочет. Но смысл именно тот, что это ради социалистической родины, ради партии это сделано.
The trial was a sham. The witnesses were bogus and their evidence false. Bukharin confessed to a general conspiracy charge, but turned the tables on the court by denying the detail of the accusation. His final speech expressed his complete loyalty to the party. Yet the motive behind his confession was perhaps less duty to party unity than fears for the safety of his wife and young child.
Ну, не знаю. Может быть, Николай Иванович заработал мне жизнь все-таки. Не знаю. Так что очень множество сил действовало. Потом пытки. И, несомненно, было колоссальное количество показаний против Бухарина, против Рыкова, потому что в первую очередь нужно было их убить. И они достигались ужасающими пытками. И это уже теперь доказано. Что касается Николая Ивановича, я слышала, что его физически не пытали, но насколько это верно, я не знаю. Ну так, может, пытали Рыкова. Если Рыков уже дал показания, это было страшным ударом. Я не знаю, кто первый дал показания. Это трудно сказать. Но так или иначе, одно то, что они могли показывать друг против друга, уже говорит о том, какие методы к ним применялись.
Stalin's chief prosecutor, Vyshinsky, summed up the spirit of the times.
Вся наша страна от малого до старого ждет и требует одного. Изменников и шпионов, продавших врагу нашу родину, расстрелять, как поганых псов. Требует наш народ одного. Раздавите проклятую гадину.
Bukharin, Rykov, and most of the others were shot. Bukharin's wife, Anna, spent over 20 years in the camps and Siberian exile. She did not see her baby son for 19 years. Trotsky, in exile in Mexico, was top of Stalin's hit list. Trotsky had been the leading figure alongside Lenin in both the revolution and civil war, a place in history Stalin bitterly envied. Trotsky tried to convince a world largely seduced by Stalin's propaganda that Stalin was in fact a dangerous despot.
Stalin's trial against me is built upon false confessions extorted by modern inquisitorial method in the interest of the ruling clique. There are no crime in history more terrible in intention or execution than the Moscow trials of Zinoviev Kamenev and Radek Petakov. These trials developed not from communism, not from socialism, but from Stalinism. That is, from the irresponsible despotism of the bureaucracy over the people.
Trotsky's house in Mexico City was heavily fortified against attack. But in May 1940, he and his family narrowly escaped death when NKVD gunmen sprayed the bedroom with bullets. An NKVD assassin then infiltrated Trotsky's circle under the name Jackson. On the 20th of August, he went into Trotsky's study and plunged an ice pick into his head. Jackson spent 20 years in prison, but was rewarded by Stalin with the Order of Hero of the Soviet Union. The decade had begun with terror in the countryside, forced collectivization, the elimination of the so-called kulaks, the man-made famine. Even though Stalin turned on the party and the intelligentsia after the murder of Kirov, he kept up the pressure on the countryside throughout the 30s.
Основная масса лагерников это были крестьяне и рабочие. Вот. Главным образом крестьяне. И они, скорее всего, как ни странно, погибали. Погибали от холода и голода, потому что они работали изо всех сил. И они поэтому скорее погибали. А массовые эти могилы разбросаны по всей нашей земле.
Kuropati Forest, just outside Minsk, capital of the Soviet Republic of Byelorussia. Between 1937 and 1941, innocent, ordinary men and women were driven here in vans by the NKVD day and night.
Ой, сколько ж я чула, это ж близко к нас. А я же ночи последние разы уже я дежурила. Так і бачила, і чула все на свете. Як плакали, як кричали, як привезуть уже стрелять. А ночь тихо, уже машины тихо ходят и все. Так и днем стреляли. Днем стреляли, было у них такое. Что днем кричали, всего было, боже мой.
Pits had been dug in the forest. 2 people at a time were brought to the edge by uniformed NKVD men, shot from behind and pushed in, layer after layer, until the pit was full.
Калі ў зімовай магіле людзі адзетыя былі, зімовую вопратку они займалі больш месца, там чалавек 150 умяшчалася, а ў летніх магілах да 260 чалавек. Усіх жа магіл у курапатах, я ўжо казаў, больш 1000. Прытым ёсць магілы даўжынёй да 10 метраў. Вось у такіх магілах 1000 чалавек расстреляныя і пахаваныя.
At least 100,000 men and women were killed in Kurapati forest. Zenon Posniak believes the total may be as high as 250,000, and they are finding other forests like Kurapati. No one will know how many died under Stalin in the 30s until Soviet archives are opened. Maybe not even then. Estimates range from 8 to 14 million people killed. Even children were in the camps.
Мы гуляли по территории Карлага, возле колючей проволоки. Мы боялись выйти за эту зону. Мы ее так и называли «за зоной». Потому что за зоной опасность, а в зоне, видать, ее не было. Сидели охранники наверху. Они нас наверняка охраняли. Это было счастье. И вроде бы и думать не надо. Маму-то мы знали по тюрьме, а папа и не задумывались. Есть ли папа? Сталин папа.
The country was caught in a nightmare. Children were locked up, but so too was the wife of Kalinin, president of the Soviet Union. Some of Stalin's own relatives were arrested and shot. With war looming in Europe, Stalin executed 50,000 senior military officers